So throughout the country, if states want to give a school money, they can. Even a private school, they can give money. But if it's a private religious school, maybe not. From our Education Center, Ross Izard, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, you wrote this wonderful paper. I want to get a close-up on this handsome man. This guy is who?
That is Congressman James G. Blaine.
And if Disney was going to animate a film and needed a human kind of groundhog-looking guy, I think that would probably do it right there. Anyway.
He does kind of look like a groundhog. That's true.
All right, this guy hated Catholics. What was this problem? Who is he? When was he? Give me the story.
So actually the story, it's really interesting. A lot of folks have heard about Blaine Amendments, and they've heard about Blaine, and the general sort of theme that you hear is he is an anti-Catholic guy. These are anti-Catholic amendments. A lot of ways that's true, but the story actually starts a long time before James G. Blaine, back when public schools in the country were not irreligious, but Protestant. Kids were reading the Bible, they were singing hymns, they were going to chapel services. They were very much, that's exact. They were Protestant schools. At the same time, you had a whole bunch of Catholic immigration going on, and folks were very concerned that the Catholicism was going to make its way into the schools, that they would need to worry about the papists infiltrating their schools. And so they started coming up with...
Those damn Italians.
They're dangerous people. Yeah. So they started coming up with ways to keep the Catholics out and to make sure that when the Catholics felt uncomfortable in Protestant schools, for obvious reasons, and started their own schools, that those schools couldn't get access to the same funding. So that sort of built up all the way through the 1800s. And then in 1875, James G. Blaine realized that putting something out there to sort of take advantage of that anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic sentiment right ahead of the 1876 presidential election would be a great way for him to get votes. And so there's actually some really good evidence that Blaine himself was not anti-Catholic, but that if he winked at the right people, he might be able to get enough votes to get himself the presidential nomination. So it kind of gets tied back into political ambition, which is fascinating, actually.
All right, that part I've never heard about. That's fascinating. So this guy was a congressman during Lincoln's administration, if I recall.
He was back during that time.
Republican?
Yes.
All right, I had to think about that one.
I had to think about it.
All right, so what I hear is that every state that wanted to get into the Union had to have a so-called Blaine Amendment in it. What does the Blaine Amendment say, for instance, in Colorado's Constitution?
Sure. So the thing that happened is James G. Blaine tried to put a constitutional amendment on the U.S. Constitution that would ban any sort of aid to, quote, sectarian institutions. And so it didn't say no aid to religious institutions. It said sectarian. And the reason that they did that was because sectarian was a code word for Catholic. Could also be a code word for any other type of religion that we really don't like that much, but in this case, it meant Catholic. So they stuck that in there to make sure those Catholics couldn't get access to that money that would go to their schools. There were some of these sort of things floating around before he introduced his congressional amendment in 1875, but after that, it sort of became the de facto standard for state constitutions. So, for example, Colorado was having its constitutional convention at roughly the same time that this stuff was going on.
1876.
They were watching it. They realized that this was what was happening. They did not want to get involved with the politics of the 1876 election, particularly because they had already been shot down for statehood a couple of times before this. They figured they better play nice. They got involved in this. We wound up with their very own Blaine Amendment here in Colorado.
And so, in other words, Coloradans did it to themselves, saying, let's just keep it easy, keep Blaine happy, put it in there. Now, 38 states. Do I have that number right?
That's right.
38 states. I'm imagining mostly Western states.
Most of them were Western, and that's kind of as the statehood crept westward across the continent there. You saw more and more people adopting those things right out of the gate. And a lot of them, they're called Blaine Amendments. They actually, most of the time, were not amendments. They were things that were put into constitutions from the very beginning. So they've been there from the start.
Blaine clause or the Blaine phrase or whatever it is.
Correct.
So here we are 150 years later, and this guy's political ambition is now tripping up kids' education, which is fascinating to me. So his work, which you're saying he didn't even really care that much about, is keeping how many kids from getting a better education?
Hundreds of thousands. And actually, on the point that you just mentioned, it's funny. After that amendment failed to get him the nomination for president in 1876, he never talked about it again. It wasn't in his autobiography. He never mentioned it again. He had no more interest after it failed to get him where he wanted to go. In the meantime...
Funny, those politicians.
Yeah.
Funny them.
And they haven't changed much. That's the sad part. But it's hundreds of thousands of kids across the country are stuck with these things. And even if you have a private school choice program in your state that allows kids to access those educational options if they maybe can't afford them otherwise, even those programs are constantly being sued. And the weapon of choice that is always used against them is this Blaine Amendment, the idea of aid to sectarian institutions.
Let's bring it right here to Colorado. We have an incredible voucher program that boiled up from the local level in Douglas County. Now, most voucher programs or choice programs or scholarship programs, they go by a lot of different names, are forced down from the state. In D.C., it was from the federal government that did it. In Milwaukee, it was from the state. In Cleveland, it was from the state. Dougco was really different in that the school district wanted to help some kids who needed a better education or a different education, particularly kids who had autism or some other things, that said, what we have here isn't working, but there's a school over there that might work. Let's help you get your kid the education. They developed this program, and of course, teachers union came swooping down, brought it into court. It went to the Colorado Supreme Court. It's still enjoined. That is, the Supreme Court heard the whole case and ruled, thanks to this guy's work 150 years ago, in Colorado, we can't give this money to a kid's family to use for a Catholic school or any religious school.
So our Supreme Court here in Colorado broke with a whole bunch of legal tradition on that front in terms of private school choice programs have already been ruled constitutional under the U.S. Constitution. They've been ruled
by the
constitutional
United States Supreme Court.
By the U.S. Supreme Court. Under most of the state Supreme Courts that have looked at it, they've decided that the aid goes to parents and kids who pick where the money goes. It's neutral with respect to religion. It's okay. Our court said the opposite. They said even indirect aid, even if you get to pick where it goes, that qualifies as a problem. And so they have said this program can't exist. They struck it down. The district is currently appealing that up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And if they were to get it there, we would have an extraordinary opportunity to actually have the court take a look at this particular issue.
Because the Colorado Supreme Court ruled and put everything on this guy's doorstep. The reason they enjoined what's going on in Douglas County is because of the Blaine verbiage in our Constitution.
Correct.
All right. So, in other words, in legal terms, there are messy rulings, there are clean rulings. This is a very clean ruling. It's focused on one thing. It's not a test if you have 3 out of 5 factors and maybe one of the factors is no. This is all about Blaine. Along comes Trump, changes the trajectory of everything, and we might soon have Gorsuch as a Supreme Court justice. How does that bode for Colorado?
So I think in this case it bodes very well. So U.S. Supreme Court hasn't decided if they'll take this case yet. They've got one more Blaine-related case ahead of that, which they'll be hearing in April, probably ruling on this summer. Then they'll get to decide whether or not they're going to take this one. If Judge Gorsuch is there, he will be able to probably get it in so the court actually hears it, and then presumably, given that he's from Colorado and given the fact that I think this is largely a settled legal matter in a lot of different ways, we could get a ruling that would essentially eviscerate Blaine amendments across the country. It would be enormous, maybe the biggest thing that's happened in education for the last 50 years. It could be huge.
And again, I'm always just amazed how many things start off in Colorado and grow organically to change the nation. Colorado is the first state to have a referendum on women's suffrage, first to have legal recreation, first to have the taxpayer bill of rights, first on term limits, and now this legal action could free children in 38 states. Now, mind you, that means the legislatures there or the school districts or somebody else has to take advantage of that.
Sure, that's right. I mean, it still needs to be actually adopted and passed by usually legislatures, but in this case, the school board. But that's where these decisions should be made. They should be made by folks who are elected to make these kind of decisions, not by lawyers who are paid to sue programs across the country that are designed to help children. So I actually think that's a good thing.
Should this break the kids' way, what happens in Colorado?
So if that were to go our way, and there are kind of 10 different ways that it could go, court stuff gets complicated pretty quickly. But if we were to get this sort of holy grail ruling that said Blaine amendments don't work under the U.S. Constitution, they're a violation of religious protections that are buried down in that First Amendment that nobody likes to talk about. If that were to happen, the Douglas County program itself all of a sudden becomes constitutional under our state constitution and can be pursued. But more importantly, we can start having really serious conversations about statewide private school choice programs if there was the need and the desire to do that on the part of the legislature.
Watch out. I have a feeling that the unions would like to somehow pull this case away from Dougco, so that doesn't happen. Ross, thank you. Read this. Go to the website, independenceinstitute.org. Tell a friend about the Independence Institute. Listen for me on KHOW Radio. Read me in the Denver Post. Call me sometime because I'm a really lonely guy. We'll see you next week.